The autumn breeze rustled through the maple trees as Linda Mitchell stirred her coffee, sitting on her favorite porch swing. At 38, she hadn't expected to find love again, especially not after the tough years of raising her daughter alone. But life had a funny way of surprising you when you least expected it. She smiled, remembering how she first met Robert Wilson at her best friend's backyard barbecue. He had been manning the grill, wearing a ridiculously bright Kiss the Cook apron and telling dad jokes that were so bad they actually became funny. Linda remembered how her daughter, Amy, had rolled her eyes at his jokes but couldn't help giggling anyway. Robert wasn't what she had imagined as her second chance at love. He was different from the polished businessman her friends had tried to set her up with over the years. His real estate development company was successful, sure, but it was his genuine warmth that drew people in. The way he remembered everyone's coffee orders at their local cafe, or how he always carried extra umbrellas in his car to give to strangers when it rained. Their first date had been wonderfully ordinary, dinner at a small Italian restaurant where the owner knew Robert by name. He told her stories about growing up in a small town, about his dreams of building communities instead of just houses, and how he'd worked his way up from being a construction worker. Linda found herself talking about themes she rarely shared: her fears about being a single mom, her late-night worries about Amy's future, and her secret dream of opening a small bookstore someday. The next 2 years passed like pages turning in a favorite book. Robert became a constant in their lives, showing up at Amy's debate competitions, helping with college application essays, and even adopting their rescue cat's grumpy older brother when the shelter couldn't separate them. He fit into their little family like he'd always been meant to be there. The proposal came during a regular Sunday morning breakfast. No fancy restaurant, no elaborate sit-up, just the three of them in their kitchen, with burnt toast and 2 strong coffee. Robert had looked at Linda across the table, pancake syrup somehow on his chin, and said, "You know, I think we should make this permanent." He pulled out a simple ring from his pocket, and before he could even properly ask, Linda was nodding yes, while Amy recorded the whole thing on her phone, laughing and crying at the same time. Their small town buzzed with excitement over the engagement. Linda's flower shop was flooded with well-wishers, and even Mrs. Henderson, the town's resident gossip, had nothing but good things to say. The wedding plans started small but grew as more people wanted to be part of their celebration. Robert insisted on handling most of the arrangements, saying Linda deserved to be surprised on her special day. Looking back, maybe that should have been the first sign: his insistence on controlling the wedding details, the way he smoothly deflected questions about his past, how he always had a perfect explanation for everything. But when you're in love, red flags just look like flags, and Linda was too happy to notice the shadows beginning to gather at the edges of her perfect story. As she sat on that porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Linda had no idea that her teenage daughter was about to uncover a truth that would shatter their carefully built dreams. She couldn't know that in just a few weeks, that same porch would become the place where she would sit and wonder how she had missed all the signs, or that it would eventually become the spot where she would finally find the strength to rebuild her life once again. The wedding invitations sat in neat stacks on her coffee table, their elegant script announcing a celebration of love. The irony of those perfectly printed cards would only become clear later when they served as evidence in a case that would make headlines across 3 states. But for now, Linda simply sipped her coffee, her heart full of hope for the future, blissfully unaware that sometimes the greatest acts of love come not from romantic gestures, but from the courage of a daughter determined to protect her mother at any cost. Amy sat cross-legged on her bed, her physics textbook open but forgotten as she stared at the photo on her phone. Something wasn't adding up, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing an important piece of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed. The photo showed Robert at what he claimed was his company's groundbreaking ceremony from last spring. He stood proudly in a hard hat, golden shovel in hand. But Amy remembered clearly that last spring he had told them he was in Colorado dealing with a family emergency. When she'd mentioned this discrepancy at breakfast, he'd laughed it off, saying she must have mixed up the dates. Her mom had given her that look, the one that said, "Don't make waves," but Amy couldn't let it go. It wasn't just the photo. Little things had been piling up like autumn leaves, each one small enough to brush away, but together forming a pattern she couldn't ignore. like how he always had two phones but said one was strictly for work, or how he'd get these calls that make him step outside, his voice dropping to a whisper even though he claimed they were just about property deals. The strangest part was his reaction whenever Amy's best friend Beth's mom was around. Mrs. Parker worked at the state real estate licensing board, and every time she showed up at school events, Robert would suddenly remember an urgent appointment. Once, Amy had mentioned his impressive development portfolio to Mrs. Parker, hoping to make conversation, and the woman had frowned, saying she'd never heard of his company. Then there were the stories that didn't quite match up. He told Mom he grew up in Seattle, but when Amy's grandparents visited and mentioned Seattle's famous Pike Place market, he'd seemed confused about basic landmarks. When called out, he'd quickly recovered, claiming he'd actually grown up in the suburbs and rarely went downtown. Amy started keeping notes in her phone, labeling the folder wedding details in case anyone looked. She wrote down every inconsistency, every strange phone call, every time his stories didn't match previous versions. She felt guilty, like she was betraying her mom's happiness, but something in her gut told her this was important. The turning point came during a casual Sunday dinner. Mom had mentioned wanting to invite Robert's sister to the bridal shower, and he tensed up for just a second before saying his sister was traveling abroad. But Amy distinctly remembered him saying his sister was a homebody who never left their hometown. When she'd caught his eye across the table, he'd given her a look she'd never seen before, something cold that made her skin crawl. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about her mom's savings, the money from Grandma that was supposed to be for Amy's college fund. Mom had mentioned possibly investing it in Robert's new development project, saying it would be a great way to grow their family's future together. The next morning, Amy started doing what she did best, research. She logged into the school's library database, determined to learn everything she could about real estate development companies in their state. She reached out to Beth, whose computer skills were even better than hers, and together they started digging deeper. As she sat in her room that evening, surrounded by sticky notes and open laptop tabs, Amy felt the weight of what she might discover pressing down on her shoulders. Her mom was humming in the kitchen, probably working on wedding plans, sounding happier than she had in years. Amy glanced at the framed photo on her desk. Her and her mom at the beach last summer, both laughing as waves crashed behind them. That photo reminded her why she had to keep digging, even if what she found might break both their hearts. She picked up her phone and hesitated over Beth's number. Her friend had texted earlier, saying she'd found something weird in the business registration databases. Amy took a deep breath, remembering what her mom always said about trusting your instincts. Her instincts were screaming now, and she couldn't ignore them anymore. With trembling fingers, she dialed Beth's number, knowing that whatever they discovered next would change everything. 2 weeks before the wedding, the spring afternoon started like any other. Amy was helping pack boxes in Robert's home office, carefully wrapping picture frames and sorting through papers. Her mom was downstairs, coordinating with the moving company about their upcoming move into the new house. The radio played softly in the background, some old love song that made Amy think about how much had changed in the past few months. That's when she found it, a small black flash drive, tucked behind the desk drawer she was emptying. It would have been easy to miss if the drawer hadn't stuck, forcing her to peer inside with her phone's flashlight. She held it up, wondering if she should just add it to the box of office supplies. But something made her pause. Maybe it was the way it was hidden, or maybe it was all those little doubts that had been building up like storm clouds. Annie glanced at the door, hearing her mom's laughter float out from downstairs. Robert had left for a business emergency an hour ago, another one of those sudden departures that had become so common lately. Her heart pounding, she pulled out her laptop from her backpack. The flash drive's contents were mostly locked, but Amy hadn't spent countless hours in computer club for nothing. Some files were accessible, and what she found made her stomach twist. There were folders labeled with different years, each containing scanned documents. Driver's licenses with Robert's photo but different names, business registration papers for companies that didn't seem to exist, and bank statements with figures that made her eyes widen. Her hands shaking, Annie texted Beth, "Need you. Now, bring your dad's external hard drive." Beth, bless her, didn't ask questions. 20 minutes later, she slipped in through the back door while Amy's mom was busy with the movers in the front yard. What's going on? Beth whispered as they huddled over Amy's laptop in the office. Amy wordlessly pointed to the screen. Beth, whose father worked in digital security, pulled out a small device. A gift from her dad that she'd promised to use only in emergencies. "This feels like an emergency," she muttered, connecting it to the flash drive. The next hour felt like watching a horror movie in slow motion. More files unlocked, revealing a pattern that made both girls feel sick. Robert Wilson was just the latest in a series of names. There were wedding photos, at least 3 different ceremonies, with 3 different women. News articles about investment scams. Court documents about fraud charges. And most chillingly, bank transfer records showing large sums of money moving between accounts. "Amy," Beth said slowly, "look at these dates." She pointed to a pattern of bank transfers. Large sums would appear in an account, then gradually disappear over several months. The last transfer date on each account lined up with news articles about missing persons reports, women who had apparently left town suddenly, leaving everything behind. Annie felt the room spin. She thought about her mom's inheritance money, how Robert had been subtly suggesting they invested in his latest project, how he'd been pushing to add his name to their family's accounts just in case of emergencies. "We need help," Beth said firmly, squeezing Amy's hand. "Real help. Adult help." Amy nodded, her mind racing. The wedding was in 2 weeks. The invitations were sent, deposits paid, her mom's dream dress hanging upstairs. How do you tell someone their whole future is built on lies? Just then, they heard a car in the driveway. Robert's distinctive engine sound. Beth quickly disconnected the drive, shoving everything into her bag. "Copy what you can," Amy whispered urgently. "I'll stall him." As Beth slipped out the back door, Amy heard Robert's footsteps on the stairs. She quickly rearranged some boxes, trying to look busy. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he would hear it. "Need any help up here?" His voice was friendly, normal. How could it sound so normal? "Just finishing up," Amy managed to say, proud that her voice didn't shake. She turned to face him, forcing a smile. For a moment, their eyes met, and she saw something flicker across his face, something that made her wonder if he knew she knew. That night, lying in bed, Amy stared at her ceiling, the weight of her discovery pressing down like a physical thing. Beth had texted. She'd managed to copy most of the files. Now they had proof. Real, solid proof. But proof of what exactly? And more importantly, what were they going to do with it? Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow, she would figure out how to save her mom from making the biggest mistake of her life. But for now, she listened to her mom humming in the next room, probably working on wedding details, and felt tears slide down her cheeks. Sometimes growing up meant making impossible choices. She just hadn't expected it to happen like this. Morning sunlight streamed through the library windows as Amy and Beth huddled over a computer in the far corner, their faces pale in the screen's blue glow. They'd been here since the library opened, skipping their first classes with carefully forged notes about dentist appointments. This was more important than calculus. "Look at this," Beth whispered, pointing to an old newspaper article she'd found. The photo showed a younger Robert, except here he was Richard Thompson, standing proudly in front of another real estate development sign. The article was from 3 years ago, 2 states over. The comments section was filled with angry people claiming they'd lost their life savings in what turned out to be a fake development project. Amy's hands trembled as she pulled up another tab. "I found his real name," she said quietly. "It's Paul Anderson. He grew up in a small town in Ohio. Got his first arrest for fraud when he was 22, something about selling fake concert tickets." She paused, swallowing hard. But that's not the worst part. Beth leaned closer as Amy clicked through a series of police reports. Paul Anderson had perfected his scheme over the years. He would move to a new town, establish himself as a successful businessman, and then target wealthy single women, especially widows or divorcees with substantial savings. He'd romance them, propose marriage, and then convince them to invest in his latest development project. By the time the women realized something was wrong, he'd be gone, along with their money. 3 marriages, Annie read, her voice shaking, never divorced, just disappeared and started over somewhere else. She clicked through more documents. And look at this pattern. He always does it the same way. gets them to transfer their money about a week before the wedding, says it's to set up joint accounts for their new life together. Beth grabbed Amy's arm. "Didn't your mom mention something about meeting with the bank next week to discuss combining accounts?" Amy nodded, feeling sick. She's so excited about it, keeps saying it shows how much he trusts her, how committed he is to their future. She closed her eyes, remembering her mom's happy face as she talked about their plans. She's already signed the papers to sell the bookstore. She's going to put all that money into his new development project. "We have to tell her," Beth said firmly. "Today." But Amy hesitated. "You don't know my mom like I do. She's not going to believe this without absolute proof." And even then, she trailed off, thinking about how happy her mom had been lately. How she'd finally started singing again while making dinner, something she hadn't done since Amy's dad left. The girls spent the next hour organizing their evidence. They created a timeline, linking each of Paul/Robert/Richard's identities to specific crimes. They found social media posts from his previous victims, warning others but posted too late to stop his next scheme. Most heartbreaking were the forum posts from children of his other victims, kids like Emmy who had watched their mothers lose everything. Some of these women had to declare bankruptcy, Annie read, her voice hollow. One lost her house. Another had to move in with her sister. She thought about their cozy home, about the bookstore her mom had built from nothing after the divorce. "We can't let this happen to her." Just then, Amy's phone buzzed. A text from her mom. "Honey, where are you? School called about your absence." "I have to go," Amy said, quickly saving their research to a secure folder. "But we need help. Adult help. Someone who'll know what to do with all this." Beth's face lit up. "What about my Aunt Carol? The one who works at the police station? She's handled fraud cases before." Amy remembered Carol, a kind-faced woman with sharp eyes who always seemed to notice everything at family gatherings. "Can you talk to her? Today? Without letting anyone else know?" Beth nodded, already pulling out her phone. "I'll tell her it's urgent. Family emergency." As Amy packed up her laptop, she glanced at the window. The spring day looked so normal outside. People walking dogs, kids playing in the park across the street. How could everything look so ordinary when her whole world was about to explode? "Amy," Beth called softly as she headed for the door. "Whatever happens, you're doing the right thing. Remember that." Amy nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She had less than a week to stop her mom from losing everything. Less than a week to expose a career criminal. Less than a week to break her mom's heart in order to save her. Outside, cherry blossoms drifted down like snow, reminding Amy of the wedding decorations her mom had chosen. Everything was supposed to be perfect. White flowers, twinkling lights, her mom's dream dress. Instead, Amy was about to turn it all into a nightmare. But as she walked home, rehearsing what she would say to her mom, she kept reminding herself of those other families, those other lives destroyed. She couldn't let her mom become just another name on a police report, another warning post that came too late to help anyone else. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect spring day every bride dreams about. Amy stood in the church's bridal suite, watching her mom twirl in her wedding dress, the soft white fabric catching the light from the stained glass windows. The other bridesmaids were fussing with the veil, everyone chattering excitedly. Only Annie remained quiet, the manila envelope in her bag feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "Honey, are you feeling okay?" her mom asked, catching Amy's reflection in the mirror. "You've been so quiet all morning." Annie forced a smile. "Just nervous, I guess." It wasn't exactly a lie. Her stomach felt like it was tied in knots, but not from normal wedding day jitters. The past week had been a blur of activity. Beth's Aunt Carol had taken their evidence seriously, very seriously. She'd made some calls, pulled some records, and confirmed their worst fears. But building a proper case would take time. Time they didn't have, not with the wedding happening today and the bank transfer scheduled for Monday morning. Look what just arrived. One of the bridesmaids burst in with a huge bouquet of white roses. "From Robert. The card says, 'To my future wife, can't wait to start our new life together.'" Annie watched her mom's face light up as she read the card and felt her heart crack a little more. How could she do this? How could she destroy her mom's happiness on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life? But then she remembered the photos Beth's aunt had shown them, other brides, other wedding days, other happy faces that had later crumpled in devastation when they realized they'd lost everything. Some of these women were still paying off debts years later. One had lost her home of 30 years. Outside, she could hear guests arriving, their cheerful voices floating up through the windows. The church was full of their friends and family, people who had supported them through the tough years after Dad left, people who had celebrated when Mom found love again. They all thought they were here to witness a beautiful beginning. Instead, Amy's phone buzzed. A text from Beth. Aunt Carol says everything's ready. Officers are standing by. Just give the signal. Another text followed quickly. You can do this. Remember, better heartbreak now than bankruptcy later. The wedding coordinator stuck her head in the door. 20 minutes, everyone. Time for final touches. Amy watched as her mom's best friends gathered around her, adjusting her dress, dabbing at happy tears, sharing excited hugs. This was the moment. She had to decide now. Taking a deep breath, Amy pulled the envelope from her bag. Mom, she said softly, I need to show you something, and I need you to promise to look at it before you say anything. Her mom turned, still smiling. Honey, can it wait? We're about to. No, Amy cut in, her voice trembling but firm. It can't wait. Please, Mom. This is the most important thing I've ever had to tell you. Something in Amy's tone made her mom pause. The other bridesmaids sensed the tension and quietly slipped out, leaving mother and daughter alone. Amy, you're scaring me. What's wrong? With shaking hands, Amy pulled out the documents, the police reports, the newspaper articles, the photos of other weddings, other brides. As her mom began to read, Amy watched the color drain from her face. This can't be real, her mom whispered. There must be some mistake. There's more, Amy said gently, pulling up the secure folder on her phone. Beth's aunt, you remember, the police detective. She helped us verify everything. Robert Wilson isn't his real name. He's done this before, Mom, multiple times. The bouquet of roses slipped from her mom's hands, white petals scattering across the floor like snow. Outside, the church bells began to chime, announcing it was almost time for the ceremony to begin. Annie could hear the organist starting the prelude music. Her mom sank into a chair, the full skirt of her wedding dress pulling around her like a deflated cloud. All those business trips, she said softly. All those late-night phone calls. The way he insisted on handling all the financial paperwork. She looked up at Amy, her eyes filled with tears. Why didn't I see it? Because he's good at this, Amy said, kneeling beside her mom's chair. He's been doing it for years. But Mom, listen to me. We caught him in time. Your money is still safe. The bank transfer isn't until Monday. We can stop this. Through the door, they could hear the wedding coordinator calling 5-minute warning. Soon someone would come looking for them. The church was full of guests, waiting to witness a wedding that Amy now knew shouldn't happen. Her mom stood up slowly, still clutching the documents. In that moment, Amy saw the strength that had gotten them through all the hard years, the strength that had let her mom build a new life as a single parent, the strength that had taught Amy to always stand up for what was right, no matter how hard it might be. What do we do now? Her mom asked quietly. Amy pulled out her phone, her finger hovering over Beth's number. We tell the truth, she said, and then we make sure he never does this to anyone else. The church hallway buzzed with confused whispers as the wedding coordinator rushed back and forth, trying to understand why the ceremony hadn't started. In the bridal suite, Amy watched as Beth's Aunt Carol, still in her formal guest dress, quietly spoke with her mom. 2 plainclothes officers stood discreetly by the door, while Beth kept lookout in the hallway. Your daughter did exactly the right thing, Carol was saying gently. We've been tracking this man for months, but he's always managed to stay one step ahead of us. You're actually the first person we've been able to warn in time. Emmy's mom sat very still, her wedding dress creating a soft white island in the middle of the chaos. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady when she spoke. He's really done this before. To other women? Carol nodded, pulling out her badge and some official documents. At least 7 times that we know of. Different names, different cities, but always the same pattern. He's smart careful. He makes sure everything looks legitimate until it's too late. A knock at the door made everyone jump. "Mrs. Mitchell?" It was the wedding coordinator again. "Robert is asking what's going on. The guests are getting restless." The officers exchanged glances. "He might try to run if he suspects something's wrong," one whispered to Carol. Amy's mom stood up suddenly, her dress rustling. "Then we don't let him suspect." Everyone turned to look at her. There was a new strength in her voice, a determination that made Amy's heart swell with pride. "Tell him I'm having a minor dress emergency. Buy us a few more minutes." As the coordinator hurried away, Carol quickly outlined their plan. They had officers covering all exits and more units waiting outside. They needed to keep everything quiet for just a little longer to make sure they had everyone in position. But plans, even careful ones, sometimes go sideways. One of the younger bridesmaids, not knowing what was happening, had gone to tell Robert about the police cars she'd spotted pulling up behind the church. Amy, watching through the door crack, saw the exact moment he realized something was wrong. His face changed, the charming smile disappearing like it had never existed. "He's moving," Amy whispered urgently, heading for the side door. Everything happened very fast after that. Robert, dropping all pretense, shoved past the surprised wedding coordinator. The officers moved quickly, but he was already running down the hallway that led to the kitchen exit. Guests stood up in their pews, craning their necks to see what was happening. Someone screamed. Amy's mom stepped out of the bridal suite just as Robert looked back over his shoulder. Their eyes met for one long moment. Later, Amy would remember how her mom stood there in her wedding dress, looking more regal than afraid, while the man she'd almost married showed his true face at last. "Stop him!" someone shouted. Beth's dad, a former track star, was already moving to block the kitchen door. Another guest, Amy's former soccer coach, stepped into the hallway, creating an obstacle. Robert tried to change direction, but his fancy wedding shoes slipped on the polished floor. The officers caught up with him just as he reached the baptismal font. There was a brief scuffle, quickly contained. As they led him away in handcuffs, the beautiful flower arrangements he insisted on paying for swayed in the draft from the open door. The church erupted in confused conversations. Amy heard snippets as she stood by her mom. "What's happening? Did he really? I'd always thought something seemed off." Mrs. Henderson, the town gossip, was already on her phone, no doubt spreading the news across 3 counties. But Amy wasn't paying attention to any of that. She was watching her mom, who stood very straight, still in her wedding dress, as Carol explained what would happen next. There would be statements to make, papers to sign, other victims to contact. "I'm so sorry, Mom," Annie whispered, slipping her hand into her mother's. Her mom squeezed her hand tight. "Don't be. You saved me. You saved us." She looked around at the chaos of the interrupted wedding, the flowers, the scattered programs, the concerned faces of their friends and family. "It's not the ending I expected for today, but maybe it's the one we needed." Beth appeared with Amy's mom's regular clothes and a garment bag for the wedding dress. Some of the guests were already starting to help take down decorations, while others gathered around to offer support. Amy's old piano teacher was organizing an impromptu gathering at her house, because we're not letting all that reception food go to waste, and nobody should be alone today. As Amy helped her mom change out of the wedding dress, carefully hanging up the gleaming white fabric that represented so many dreams and hopes, she caught sight of their reflection in the mirror. They looked tired, a bit shell-shocked, but somehow stronger together. Her mom managed a small smile. "You know what?" her mom said, straightening her shoulders. "I think I'll reopen the bookstore, maybe at a coffee shop section this time." Amy hugged her mom tight, feeling tears finally start to fall, not sad tears exactly, but the kind that come after you've been brayed for a very long time and can finally let go. Outside, they could hear their community rallying around them, proving that even interrupted weddings and broken dreams couldn't break the bonds of real love, the kind between a mother and daughter, between friends and family, between people who chose to stand together when it mattered most. 6 months after the wedding that wasn't, the little bookstore on Main Street was buzzing with activity. The newly added cafe corner filled the space with the aroma of fresh coffee and warm pastries. Amy stood behind the counter, arranging a display of mystery novels, fitting, given how their own mystery had played out. The bell above the door chimed as Beth's Aunt Carol walked in, carrying a thick manila envelope. "Is your mom here?" she asked, smiling as she breathed in the coffee smell. "I've got some news she'll want to hear." Amy's mom emerged from the back room, wiping flour from her hands. She'd discovered a talent for baking during their recovery period, and her cinnamon rolls had become locally famous. "Good news, I hope?" Carol's smile widened. "The best. The judge approved the settlement. All his assets have been frozen and will be distributed among the victims. And," she paused for effect, "you're getting full restitution, every penny he tried to take, plus damages." The three women settled into the cozy reading nook Amy's mom had created near the window. Outside, fall leaves danced on the sidewalk where just months ago they'd watched police cars pull away from the church. "They found 6 other women," Carol continued, spreading out the documents. "Once we caught him, they all came forward. Some had lost everything. But now, because of what you two did, they're getting their money back. More importantly, he's going away for a long time." Amy watched her mom's face as she absorbed the news. These past months hadn't been easy. There had been dark days when her mom barely got out of bed, days when the weight of betrayal felt too heavy to bear. But there had also been surprising moments of light. The day after the failed wedding, they'd opened the front door to find casseroles and comfort food filling their porch, enough to feed them for weeks. Their neighbors had rallied around them, helping to reopen the bookstore that Robert had convinced her mom to close. Beth's parents had offered legal advice, while Amy's old teachers spread the word about the store's revival. "We're doing a video call next week," Carol added, sipping her coffee. "Some of the other victims want to thank you personally. Your story gave them courage to come forward. You're not just victims, you're heroes to these women." Amy's mom reached for her hand, squeezing it tight. "No, my daughter's the hero. I still can't believe how brave you were, sweetheart. Standing up to him, risking everything to protect me." "I learned from the best," Amy replied, thinking of all the times she'd watched her mom stand strong through tough times. "Remember what you always told me. Trust your instincts." The bell chimed again as customers walked in. A young woman and her teenage daughter, regulars at the store now. Amy's mom had started a book club for single parents and their kids, creating a space where they could share stories and support each other. It had quickly become the heart of their community. "Oh no, and one more thing," Carol said, pulling out a newspaper. The story made national news. People are calling it a wake-up call about romance scams. Several police departments are developing new protocols based on how this case was handled. Amy picked up the newspaper, reading the headline, "Mother-Daughter Do Unveils Wedding Scammer Scheme." Below was a photo of their bookstore, now a symbol of resilience and new beginnings. The article mentioned how their story had inspired a fraud prevention program in local schools, teaching young people to trust their instincts and protect their loved ones. Amy had even been invited to speak at several workshops, sharing her experience with other teenagers. Later that evening, as they closed up the store, Amy watched her mom arranging books in the front window. The display featured stories of courage and new beginnings, her mom's way of turning their pain into purpose. The setting sun painted the shop in warm colors, making everything glow. "You know what I realized?" her mom said, stepping back to admire her work. "Sometimes the happy ending isn't the one you expected. Sometimes it's better." Amy thought about everything they'd been through, the fear, the doubt, the heartbreak, but also the strength they'd found, the bonds they'd strengthened, the lives they'd helped save. Their story hadn't ended at the altar that day. Instead, it had opened a new chapter, one they were writing together. The last customer of the day paused at the door, an elderly woman clutching a romance novel. "Thank you," she said softly. "My sister, she almost fell for someone like him. But she read about your story. You saved her too." After she left, Amy and her mom stood in their cozy bookstore, surrounded by stories of all kinds. But their own story, of love, courage, and truth, was perhaps the most important one these walls had ever held. "Ice cream," her mom suggested, flipping the closed sign. It had become their tradition, ending tough days with sweet moments. "Race you to the parlor," Annie grinned, grabbing their coats. As they walked down Main Street together, the autumn air crisp and clear, Annie realized something wonderful. Sometimes stopping a happy ending could lead to an even happier beginning. Their story wasn't about a wedding that failed. It was about the courage to choose truth over illusion, about the strength of real love, and about the kind of happy endings that come not from fairy tales, but from facing reality with bravery and hope.